Now, having come this far, I'd like to just pause for a minute or two to let all this sink in. And we can, I mean, because as I said, this is not conventional wisdom. This is a little out of the box. As Tomoko was saying, very negative views. You'll find that in military camps. You'll find that in government offices. You will not find that in business and industry, because they are flocking to China and vice versa. And ultimately, in India, with liberalizing India, business and industry is having a very, very important role. Which is why in Japan also, Japanese businesses are putting pressure, for God's sake, don't expand this beyond the point. Chinese businesses are putting pressure on the PLA, for God's sake, don't affect relations with India beyond the point. So ultimately, business is unitedly speaking up in a voice which says, let's have peaceful relations with each other. So speaking for myself, I'd like to see that happen. I'd like to see a century of peace in Asia, in which no Asian power fights against any other Asian power. There is absolutely no war between any two Asian powers. We went to Kuwait for the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, 32 Asian countries, including Japan, China, India, Saudi Arabia, all these countries came together, Russia, and the idea was to set up a system in which Asian countries will not fight each other. They will not follow the model that Europe followed in the 19th century and much of the 20th. They will follow a different model, a model of peace, and that is a model that all of us are really looking at following for the sake of the one paramount objective of any government, which is to ensure that poverty is removed. It hasn't happened in India in 65 years of independence. Hopefully it will happen it could happen in the next 65 months if there's a sensible coordinated policy. Now let's go back to China. What kind of a system basically runs China? I've gone to China dozens of times. I met people at reasonable levels of the Chinese structure. Very, very levels which I don't think are reached by most people of any country. So I'm quite happy with the kind of access I have to China. I think that's, so is our Vice Chancellor, so is our Registrar, so is Dr. Pai. They're also equally happy about that. The Chinese Communist Party essentially is a kind of a club. It's basically a man's club. There are a handful of women out there in some places. You still have I think you've got a lady in the Politburo, but you still don't have a lady in the standing committee. You've never had a lady in the standing committee. It's always been men, men, men. So it's basically a boys' club. And like every club, it's got its own rules. Who is to join the club, they've got their rules. Who is to become an office bearer, they have their own rules. The kind of election they run, they have their own rules. So everything is basically done as per the rules of the Chinese Communist Party club. Now, I would like you to know that when the Vice Chancellor and Registrar came to China, I told them, forget about government, forget about media, forget about judiciary, forget about anything. There's only one reality in China, and that is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is government, is judiciary, is media, is sports and culture, is everything in China. It permeates and suffuses every aspect of life in China. If you go to a Buddhist monastery, for example, and you request the Buddhist monks to chant, and whenever I go there, I claim to be a follower of Buddhism myself, a Hindu Buddhist, if I may say so, then I go there. You'll find one person in that group of monks who will not be chanting. Then I know that one person is the Communist Party person in the monastery. Sometimes he's the head monk, sometimes he's deputy head monk, sometimes he's the most venerable this and the most venerable that. But the most venerable this has recently come after looking after agriculture in Sichuan. He has come to this monastery and he wants to go back to Beijing to look after education. So he's here on transfer and he's got to wear the robes of a monk. But he's not going to learn any chanting because he's very keen on getting back to Beijing. So every institution has got the Communist Party at the heart of it, and the final decision is taken by the Communist Party. So I'd like to say that we in Manipal have excellent relations with the Chinese Communist Party. We do not want to see regime change in China. We are extremely happy with the current regime here, and the current regime has given us two excellent partnerships, and the current regime has been extremely helpful to us. So I'd like to say that, I think I speak for the Vice Chancellor and Registrar, that we are all great admirers of the Chinese Communist Party here in Manipal. I'd like to put that for record in the interest of transparency. I don't want to hide anything, even if it's here. So, but coming back to this, so what happens is, this, let's go back to modern China, which is post-79. You had a Maoist China, that is Mao's China. Mao's China went on until Mao died in 76, and then 2-3 years after that, some kind of a gang of four, etc. continued. Deng's China is totally different from Mao's China. So let's not go back into Mao's China, because Cultural Revolution, this, that, etc. It's a huge canvas. I'm anyway going to leave others 30 minutes far behind, and I'm going to leave. You'll have to be spending time till the late evening if I'm going to discuss about Mao's China. Deng's China, Deng Xiaoping was very, very clear. He wanted China to be the #1 country in the world once again. He was a very strong Chinese nationalist. He said, the only way people are going to respect you is you have economic development. Now, you know, in India in the 1950s, we had enormous goodwill. In fact, the Korean War was basically solved on the Indian formula. The non-aligned movement was practically evolved by Jawaharlal Nehru. All over the world, Mahatma Gandhi was hailed as an amazing visionary who got freedom in a non-violent way and all that. But unfortunately, because we were still one of the poorest countries in the world, we were not really taken with great seriousness. Unfortunately. When the Chinese attacked us, for example, barring, I think, Bhutan, no other country supported us. Sri Lanka didn't support us. Pakistan, of course, did not support us. None of our non-aligned friends supported us. I think Bhutan supported us. And we are grateful to the Bhutanese for supporting us, but nobody else supported us. But the reason for that was the British left us an enormously poor country. Colonialism was extremely negative on India. It left this country absolutely impoverished. Deng Xiaoping said, the only way you're going to be respected as Chinese is if you are successful and prosperous. So as he said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as the cat catches mice. He also said certain things like, to get rich is glorious. And I think, a lot of big businessmen all over the world will have little, photographs of Deng Xiaoping as a result of that. But he focused on economic development. He downgraded the military. In fact, during Deng's time, the investment in the military came down very sharply. The PLA was removed from its privileged position in decision making. If you remember, under Mao, the PLA had a position just next to Mao. Lin Biao, for example, was defense minister. And incidentally, I don't know, not too many people are aware, Xi Jinping's first important job was as a commissar in Lin Biao's office. In Defense Minister Lin Biao's office, the young Xi Jinping was a commissar. So his early grounding in politics was at the feet of Lin Biao, the way many of us have gained in strategy as a result of this deep here. So the fact of the matter is that, Deng Xiaoping completely changed the situation by focusing on diplomacy, by being friendly with the United States, friendly across the board, and after the 1979 war with Vietnam, no more wars. 1979 was the last time the PLA got involved in active combat. After that, the PLA has never been involved in active combat after 1979. And from what the Chinese leaders who meet me tell me, they would like to see for the next 30 years also, the PLA does not get involved in active combat. For simple reason, they know a country as huge as China, a country as powerful as China, if it gets involved in active combat, it gets a very bad name, as the Americans are finding out, and as NATO is finding out with this very different set of policies. So, Deng Xiaoping selected Jiang Zemin as the next General Secretary and President of China. And he chose Zhu Rongji as the Prime Minister. Now, Zhu Rongji was an economic wizard. He was brilliant in economics. So he chose a brilliant economic wizard as Prime Minister. And in China, the Prime Minister looks after the economy, the President looks after the party. It's basically, the Prime Minister is technically under the President, but he has a lot of leeway and latitude in economic policy. So Zhu Rongji was the Prime Minister, whom Jiang Zemin, by the way, did not like at all, but he had to accept because Deng Xiaoping said so. And more importantly, Deng Xiaoping also chose the successor to Jiang Zemin. So here you have an individual, purely informally, without any law mandating that, without anything in writing, saying, look, you are going to be the president of China and general secretary for 10 years, and after that, for the next 10 years, it's going to be Hu Jintao. And thereafter, the people, you people will select who's going to happen after Hu Jintao. But for 20 years, Deng Xiaoping picks how to rule China. Why did you choose Jiang Zemin? I mean, you know, you've seen Jiang Zemin in Texan boots, and you've seen him in this thing dancing the jig, and he's supposed to be, he thinks he's a great Elvis Presley impersonator. I mean, I've heard him, I can tell you that it's not Elvis Presley. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not Elvis Presley. I don't like Elvis Presley, but even a person like me who doesn't like him would not want Jiang Zemin to be considered anywhere near Elvis Presley. But in any case, Mr. Jiang Zemin was famous as a very hard-line, tough guy on law and order. He was like Rudy Giuliani in New York. Tough line on law and order. You know, smash the guy. He did that in Tiananmen. In Tiananmen, the July 4 movement, as Arvind again will tell you, the majority of the Politburo, the majority of the standing committee was against the use of force in Tiananmen Square. They said, no, let's talk to these guys. These are our people. We'll talk to them. We'll wear them out. Let them, you know, we'll prevent food from going there. They'll finally get fed up. They'll come to us. But Deng Xiaoping went to the side of Jiang Zemin and said, no, let's use absolute force. Very extreme force was used on July 4th, in 1989 on Tiananmen. I don't know the number of people who died. No one in China is going to talk about it, but certainly the figure is extensive. Subsequent to that, there's a movement called Falun Gong. I don't know how many of you have heard of the, just put your hands up who have heard of the Falun Gong. 2? Okay, 3, 4. Good. It's basically, you know, some breathing exercises and some things like that, meditation and all that. The Falun Gong arranged along Zhongnanhai, which is where all the top Chinese leaders go. They had they encircled Zhongnanhai, about 20,000 people. The Chinese Secret Service got no indication that Zhongnanhai was going to be encircled at a particular time in the early morning of a particular day. I don't remember the exact date. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's pretty easy. 20,000 people suddenly appeared. They just stood there for a few hours, and 20,000 people just melted away as a silent protest against the fact that Falun Gong was not legalized. That scared the daylights out of Communist Party China leaders, because for them, even 20 people organizing themselves, they want to be in on the picture, they want to know. And look, we know these 20 guys organizing themselves, 20,000 was unprecedented. The actual figure I'm told from Falun Gong sources, and I mean, I know some of the leaders of the movement very well. Mr. Ping Zhang, the second in command, is in New York, and I don't think he's allowed to come to India these days, because we are very careful not to allow anti-Chinese elements to come here. But the reality is that that scared them, and Jiang Zemin went in a complete crackdown of the Falun Gong. Many people were killed, many people were sent to asylums, many people were interrogated with extreme, if I may say so, extreme use of whatever methods are there. It was an extremely brutal crackdown. So Jiang Zemin's signature, which endeared him to Deng Xiaoping, was that he was a very tough guy who would not hesitate to use brutal force against his people. He was the very opposite of Mikhail Gorbachev, who refused to use violence even when Russia was collapsing and even when the Russian Empire was collapsing. Poland went, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, there was a huge Russian army, tanks, missiles, nuclear weapons. Nobody could have basically stopped that army because it was unparalleled in the European continent. But Gorbachev made it very clear he will not use force. As soon as that happened, everybody in Poland, Romania, etc., they decided this is our chance, and they took it. So Jiang Zemin is the polar opposite of Gorbachev. Let's not forget again when Deng was talking about 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992. Let's put it in this context. It was when the entire Eastern Europe had collapsed, when the Soviet Union had collapsed, when communism had collapsed throughout Europe, and it was shaking. And there was a perception that it was only a matter of time before it hit China as well. And there were huge student movements in China. Gorbachev came, and then the students started saying, we want Gorbachev, in China, and things like that. So Deng Xiaoping felt you need a very tough guy to run China for the next 10 years and drive out any suggestion that the party can be replaced the way it has been replaced in Eastern Europe. So he chose Jiang Zemin for one quality alone, and that was a very ruthless streak in Jiang Zemin. Now, Mr. Jiang Zemin was not only ruthless, he had a heart, and he loved certain things. He likes Ferraris, he likes billionaires, he likes chartered jets, he likes anything that costs, 5, 6, 7 million dollar, 5, 6, 7 million RMB upwards. Anything below that is not good enough. But anything with about 5 or 6 million, Jiang Zemin likes that. He loves it, as a matter of fact. So during this 10 years in power, definitely there was a crackdown. The Communist Party was absolutely no danger of any kind of change or any kind of revolt or revolution or no popular revolt. But apart from that, Jiang Zemin believed in the economics of the Republican Party of the United States. He was a true Republican at heart. He believed in a trickle-down theory. You support the billionaires and you help the millionaires and everybody will become rich. Ultimately, the billionaire will give money, the millionaire will give money, and everybody from the, will start making money as a result of a trickle-down theory. So Mr. Jiang Zemin was one of the earliest followers of Reagan economics, Ronald Reagan's economics. He was a fervent follower. Reagan was there in the 80s. Mr. Jiang Zemin took over in 1992 and started following Republican economics. He built up a huge elite class in China. Now, Mr. Zhu Rongji was a little disconcerted by that. He could not be removed because both are appointed by Deng Xiaoping. In China, you have the concept of the celestial mandate. Deng was supposed to have the celestial mandate. It's a very strange thing that is intrinsic to Chinese culture or Indian culture. Now, all of us, we know at that point in time, Mahatma Gandhi. Everybody obeyed Mahatma Gandhi. And I believe that not all the decisions he took were very sensible. Some of them, in fact, were not. And the fact that we are still in this particular condition means he was not entirely a genius in terms of policy. But everybody followed him. The same way the Chinese follow somebody whom they believe has the celestial mandate of heaven. And they believe Deng Xiaoping has the mandate of heaven. So Deng Xiaoping says Jiang Zemin is good. He may be Texan boots, he may be that, he may be liking billionaires, but Deng Xiaoping has said it. And next round went to a person who Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin certainly did not like, Mr. Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao was a steady, sober bureaucrat from the lower ranks of the Communist Party, who was very much non-elitist. He was in Anhui province, which is a poor province. I would say, like in India, you've got poorer provinces. The Anhui was certainly a poorer province. And he was from there, he was from a poorer family background, and he mingled with poorer people. So basically, he was a much more of a populistic kind of person. And he said the next 10 years is going to go back to normal. After 10 years of ruthless suppression, you're going to go back to normal under Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao years, in the Western media, he gets a very bad deal. Because frankly, Hu Jintao has not been good news for the West. He's made sure China is huge competition to the West. So he gets a very bad press for the lost decade. The reality is, Chinese national income has gone up 4 times in this lost decade. I would very much love for us to have a lost decade like that. I'd be delighted if we had a lost decade. We have a found decade in which we have grown by, 1/4 of that. 4 times the Chinese national income has quadrupled under Hu Jintao. Now, before that, Zhu Rongji used the 1997-98 economic collapse in Southeast Asia caused by to do a lot of reforms of state-owned enterprises. About 29 million workers were removed from their jobs. It can happen only in China. 29 million people were just dismissed from their jobs by Zhu Rongji between 97, 98, 99. What is happening in Europe today by the market took place by bureaucratic fear in China during those days. And he reorganized the state-owned enterprises, made them lean, made them mean, made them professionally managed. With that result, today the state-owned enterprises in China are competing across the world and they're doing pretty well, of course. So you go back now to Hu Jintao. Now, Hu Jintao's vision is totally different from Jiang Zemin. To Jiang Zemin, the only people worth worrying about are people in Europe and United States itself, the Western world. Anybody else is, it's like 6 or 7 million RMB as your cutoff point for anything that's worth buying. We don't going to buy anything which is less than 6, 7. For him, only Europe, Europeans, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders were worth it. I had the great privilege of seeing this great man 2 or 3 times. But once I actually spent about 2.5 hours in the same room as him. And I'd like, before you guys get very excited by this, let me tell you, it was a room where there were roughly 1,000 people present. It was a huge banquet. And in the great hall of the people, the banqueting hall of the great hall of the people. I noticed one thing about Mr. Jiang. You had the ambassador to India, whom I knew, and he pointed out the ambassador of Russia, another chap there. Jiang never went near the ambassador of India, the ambassador of Russia, the ambassador of Venezuela, the ambassador of Ghana, the ambassador of, even Turkey. He used to go to the ambassador of Belgium, he would chit-chat with the ambassador of New Zealand, he would spend a little bit of time with the ambassador of Romania, he spent a lot of time with the ambassador of Britain. That's the only ambassadors he recognized were ambassadors from the Western world. Nobody else. The Indian ambassador was sitting in the corner, chatting with the Russian ambassador. Now I thought, these are the two largest neighbors of China. India and Russia are the two largest neighbors. They sandwich China from north and south. They're hugely important in geopolitics of China. And here's the president of China completely ignoring these two. And going off with little countries. I mean,